The morning Victor Hale came to take everything, he didn't bother to knock. He pushed open the door so hard it cracked against the wall, and Clara Voss, still in her nightclothes, still holding the mug of weak coffee she'd made from yesterday's grounds, stumbled backward into the table. Noah grabbed her arm. 10 years old and already braced for the worst kind of news. Victor stood in the doorway with two men behind him wearing sheriff's badges that looked freshly polished, and he smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won. "You've got until sundown," he said, dropping a folded paper onto the table without looking at her. "After that, anything left inside belongs to the property." Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at her son. "If this were you, if everything you'd built with nothing but your own two hands could be taken in the time it took a man to cross a threshold, what would you do?" Before we go further, if this kind of story moves you, if you believe that a woman who refuses to quit deserves to be heard, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like Clara's don't show up every day. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And when you're done watching, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to where this really started. The winter of 1888 arrived without warning and without mercy. That was the thing about the Dakota Territory in those years. The land didn't negotiate. It didn't care what you'd lost or what you'd planned or what promises had been made to you the previous spring. The cold came in from the northwest like a wall, and whatever wasn't ready simply didn't survive. Clara Voss was not ready. She had never been the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. She knew her limitations the way you know an old injury, by feel, by the particular ache it left behind on certain mornings. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since her husband Martin disappeared 8 weeks earlier. She was lean in the way that hunger makes a person lean, and her hands were already cracked from cold water and rough work, and there were moments, private moments, always after Noah fell asleep, when she sat in the near dark and shook. Not from cold, from fury. Martin Voss had been many things. He had been funny in an unexpected way, the kind of funny that caught you off guard on bad days. He had been patient with Noah in ways Clara sometimes struggled to match. He had been, in the quiet language of that time and place, a decent man. But he had also been a man who kept things from her. She didn't know the extent of it until his brother Rupert appeared at the door 3 days after the first heavy snowfall, hat in hand, face carrying the particular expression of a man delivering news he'd been rehearsing for a while. "Martin had debts," Rupert said. Clara waited. "More than I knew. More than he let on to anybody." Rupert wouldn't meet her eyes. "I was a big man, broad across the shoulders, and he had a habit of looking at the floor when he was uncomfortable, which made him look like a very large child. He borrowed against the property, the whole parcel, 3 separate lenders." "He did what?" "I'm sorry, Clara." She stared at him. The fire was low because she'd been rationing wood. Noah was at the table doing his reading lesson, and Clara could feel him go still without looking at him, the way children do when they sense the adults around them have entered dangerous territory. "What does that mean for us?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that after. "For me and Noah." Rupert finally looked at her. The guilt in his face was so thick it was almost physical. "It means the property's forfeit. There's a proceeding in January. By spring, the lenders will have the deed." "And us?" A long pause, long enough that Clara already knew. "I spoke to Margaret," he said. Margaret was his wife, a woman who had opinions about everything and warmth for almost nothing. "We've got the cousins staying through February, and the space is—" "Don't!" Clara held up one hand. "Don't finish that. Clara, I said don't." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things permanently. She could see on Rupert's face that he'd expected her to argue, to cry, to beg, that he'd come prepared for that version of this conversation. He hadn't prepared for the one where she simply looked at him until he ran out of words. "How long do we have in this house?" she said. "End of the month. Maybe a little past if the proceeding gets delayed." "Fine." She moved toward the door and held it open for him. "Thank you for coming to tell me yourself." He hesitated on the threshold. "Where will you go?" "I'll figure it out." She closed the door before he could say anything else. Noah didn't look up from his book, but after a moment he said quietly, "Are we going to be all right?" Clara crossed the room and put her hand on the top of his head. His hair needed cutting. She'd been meaning to do it for 2 weeks. Yes, she said. She didn't know if she was lying. The next 3 weeks were the worst of her life, and she had already lived through some considerable competition for that title. She sold what she could. The good china that had been her mother's. Martin's tools, the ones worth anything. A quilt she'd spent 2 years making in whatever idle hours the previous life had allowed her. She sold them to a trader named Phelps, who ran a general goods operation out of a converted barn on the edge of town, and Phelps gave her fair prices, fairer than she'd expected, and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated more than she could say. She asked around about work. She asked discreetly, because in that particular town, in that particular time, a widow asking too loudly about work attracted a different kind of attention than she wanted. The hotel needed a laundrywoman, but the pay was barely enough to cover board, let alone board for 2. The schoolhouse needed a teacher's aide, but the position wouldn't start until March, and by March the house would be gone, and they'd need somewhere to sleep long before then. She considered the letter she'd received in October, before Martin disappeared, from a woman named Gertrude Plank, who ran a boarding house in Bismarck and claimed to be looking for a reliable cook. She'd ignored it at the time because she hadn't needed to. Now she pulled it from the small cedar box where she kept important papers, read it 3 times, and tried to calculate whether the stage fare to Bismarck was something she could manage. It wasn't. She considered other options. Most of them were worse. On the 19th day after Rupert's visit, she was in the small root cellar checking the state of the remaining turnips when Noah called down to her from above. "Mama, there's a man here." She came up to find a stranger in the yard. Not unusual in itself, since the main wagon road passed less than a quarter mile from the house, and travelers sometimes came looking for water or directions. But this man wasn't traveling. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the house with the evaluating expression of someone calculating what something was worth. "Mrs. Voss?" he said when she appeared. "Yes?" "Name's Calloway. I work for Hale Freight and Land." He produced a card from his pocket and held it out. "Mr. Hale sent me to have a conversation about the property here." Clara didn't take the card. "The property isn't mine to negotiate. My husband's estate is in proceeding." "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Hale is aware of that. He's one of the lien holders." She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I didn't know that." Calloway tucked the card back into his pocket with the smooth motion of a man who'd been turned down before and wasn't troubled by it. "Well, Mr. Hale wants you to know that the proceeding's going to resolve in his favor. He holds the senior lien, and he's prepared to be generous if you vacate before the end of the month. He'll allow you to keep whatever personal items you can carry." "Whatever I can carry?" "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked at this man, at his clean coat and his careful manner and the way he'd used the word generous to describe being allowed to take her own belongings out of her own home, and she felt the fury that had been simmering in her since Rupert's visit rise up sharp and immediate. But she kept her voice quiet. "Tell Mr. Hale I'll be out by month's end." Calloway nodded. "He'll be pleased to hear it." She watched him ride away, and then she went back inside and she sat down at the table, and she stayed very still for a long time. Noah came and sat across from her. He didn't ask anything. He'd learned in these past weeks that sometimes you just had to sit with your mother in the silence and wait. "Pack what matters to you," she finally said. "The things you'd want if we couldn't come back for them." "Are we leaving?" "Yes." "Where?" She'd been thinking about that for 3 weeks. She'd been going over and over the options, the calculations, the brutal arithmetic of 2 people with almost no money and no shelter in a Dakota winter. And there was one thing, one thread she'd been pulling at and setting aside and coming back to, that she hadn't been able to shake loose. "Do you remember," she said slowly, "what old Mrs. Brecht used to say about the wagon trail past Miller Creek?" Noah thought about it. "She said there used to be a station out there, a long time ago. She said it was abandoned. She said it was falling apart. She also said the well still worked." Noah looked at her with the particular expression of a 10-year-old boy doing rapid calculations about whether his mother had completely lost her mind. "Mama, it's winter." "I know. You want us to go live in a falling-apart abandoned station in winter?" "I want us to go look at it," she said. "That's all. Just look." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What if it's too far gone?" Then we figure out something else. She met his eyes. But I'm not going anywhere as Victor Hale's charity case. You understand me? Not in this life. They left 4 days later before sunrise, with everything they could carry loaded onto a borrowed mule that Clara had traded 2 months of laundry work to secure. The temperature was 11 degrees. The sky was the particular gray of a winter morning that has no intention of brightening. Clara had packed in deliberate order of priority. First, the things Noah would need: his extra wool socks, his school reader, the small carved horse Martin had made him 2 Christmases ago. Then the practical items: her sewing kit, the good knife, the box of wooden matches wrapped in oilcloth, the half sack of cornmeal, the dried beans, the last of the salt pork. Then the papers. Every document she owned, everything that had her name on it, tucked into the same cedar box wrapped in the waterproof canvas she'd bought from Felks with the last of the China money. She took nothing that was pretty. She took nothing she couldn't defend the need for. Noah walked beside the mule without complaining, which was either evidence of his good character or evidence that he understood the seriousness of their situation well enough to know that complaining wasn't an option. Probably both. He was a boy who noticed things, who picked up the emotional weather of rooms and situations the way some people pick up languages, quickly, accurately, and without being taught. After an hour, he said, "How far is it?" "Maybe 6 miles past Miller Creek." "And if there's nothing there?" "There's something there. Mrs. Brecht saw it herself. 20 years ago." "The well doesn't move, Noah." He was quiet again, then, almost to himself, 20 years is a long time for a building. She didn't argue with that because he wasn't wrong. They reached Miller Creek just past noon and crossed at the shallow bend where the ice was thick enough to hold them, and the mule without complaint. The wind had picked up by then, coming from the northwest in the particular way that meant it wasn't planning to stop, and Clara pulled her scarf tighter across her face and kept moving. The wagon trail that Mrs. Brecht had described was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, 2 faint parallel lines in the snow that might have been tracks and might have been something else entirely. Clara followed them because she had nothing better to follow. Noah stopped walking. "Mama." She turned. He was pointing. There, set back from the trail behind a stand of bare cottonwoods, gray against gray, nearly invisible in the fading afternoon light, stood a structure. Low-roofed, partially collapsed on one side, the remnants of a fence line barely rising above the snow line. A building that looked, in every visible way, like something the world had finished with. Clara looked at it for a long moment. Then she started walking toward it. It was worse up close. The main structure had a gaping hole in the roof on the east side where the support beam had given way, probably years ago. 2 of the 4 window openings were open to the air. The frames had rotted, and the oiled paper that would have covered them had long since disintegrated. The door hung at an angle on a single surviving hinge. Inside, the floor was half covered in drifted snow, and the walls showed water damage streaking down from the ceiling in long brown stains. Noah stood in the doorway and said nothing. Clara walked the perimeter of the room, stepping over the drifted snow, pressing her palm against the walls to test their solidity, looking up at the partial ceiling and calculating. The damaged side was bad, genuinely bad, but the western portion of the structure, where the roof remained intact, was holding. The walls on that side were solid. The old stone hearth, stacked river rock mortared with what looked like clay and horsehair, was intact. Cold, dark, and filthy, but intact. Off the main room, through a low doorway, she found the bakehouse. She stopped. It was smaller than the main room, but better preserved. The roof over it was still complete, and the walls were thick enough that the cold hadn't penetrated in the same way. And there, taking up most of the back wall, was the oven. It was enormous. Whoever had built it had understood what they were doing. A barrel-vaulted clay and stone construction with a thick firebox and a wide mouth, the kind of oven designed to hold heat for hours after the fire was pulled. The kind of oven that, in the right hands, could bake 20 loaves at once. It was covered in grime. There was a crack running through the upper arch that would need repair. The iron door was seized in place with years of rust, but the structure was there. Clara put both hands on the oven's face and felt the cold stone under her palms. "Well," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Noah appeared in the low doorway. "What is it?" "It's an oven." He looked at it. "It's broken." Things that are broken can be fixed. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, with a mixture of trust and apprehension, as if he couldn't quite decide whether his mother was very brave or very foolish, and wasn't sure the difference mattered in the end. "Are we staying?" Clara turned and looked back through the doorway into the main room. The snow on the floor, the open windows, the sagging door, the cold stone hearth that hadn't held a fire in God only knew how many years. Then she looked at the oven. "Yes," she said. "We're staying." The first night was the worst thing she could remember, and she had some competition for that title too. They got a fire going in the main hearth by late afternoon. The chimney drew, which was the first genuine piece of good news, and Clara spent 2 hours packing snow into the open window frames and covering them with the canvas she'd brought, which was not enough canvas for the job, but was what she had. She wedged the broken door closed with a piece of fallen beam. She spread both blankets on the driest section of floor near the hearth, and built the fire up as high as she dared, given that she couldn't see the full state of the chimney above. Noah ate cornmeal mush without complaint. He fell asleep with the carved horse in his fist. Clara sat up and watched the fire and listened to the wind work at the building's weaknesses, probing and testing, finding every gap and crack. The cold came in under the door. It came in around the edges of the canvas. It came down from the damaged section of ceiling in a way she couldn't prevent. She sat with her knees pulled up and her coat wrapped around her shoulders, and she thought, "I could have stayed. I could have gone to Rupert. I could have accepted whatever Victor Hale was offering and been somewhere warm tonight." And then she thought, no, I couldn't. That was never actually an option. She didn't know if that made her brave or just stubborn. She suspected the line between the two was thinner than anyone liked to admit. Sometime after midnight, she heard something move outside. She went still. The fire had burned down to coals. Noah slept on, undisturbed. The sound came again, a soft padding close to the door. Something circling the building. She picked up the fire poker and stood. After a long moment, she heard whatever it was settle, a kind of scraping and settling sound, just outside the door. Then silence, except for the wind. In the morning, when she pulled the beam away from the door and pushed it open, she found a dog. It was medium-sized, with a coat the color of old copper. A tarnished, burnished, reddish-brown that caught even the weak winter light in a way that made you think of something metallic. It was lying with its back against the building, as if it had pressed itself there for warmth in the night. It raised its head when the door opened but didn't move. Clara looked at it. It looked back at her. "Where did you come from?" she said. It didn't answer, obviously, but it did thump its tail twice against the frozen ground, which she chose to take as a reasonable response. She went back inside and got a piece of the salt pork, a small piece, because they couldn't afford anything else, and brought it back out. The dog took it from her hand with a gentleness that surprised her, then stood and shook itself and looked up at her with the expression of an animal that had made a decision. "You're not ours," she told it. It sat down and waited. She looked at it for another moment. Then she went inside to wake Noah and start the day. She called the dog Brass, not because she'd decided to keep it, but because you couldn't keep calling something the dog indefinitely, and the name fit. The second day was harder than the first, which she hadn't thought was possible. She discovered that the well, the thing she'd banked almost everything on, had a rope that had rotted through, which meant drawing water required improvising a new one from the rope she'd brought for the mule. She discovered that the snow she'd packed into the window frames had a tendency to loosen as the interior warmed, requiring her to repack it every few hours. She discovered that the firewood situation, fallen timber within reasonable reach, would last them perhaps a week before she'd need to find more. Noah helped where he could, which was nearly everywhere. He was strong for his size, and he didn't waste energy on arguments or complaints, which was a quality Clara had come to value above almost everything else in a person. He repacked the windows without being asked. He found a stack of usable boards in what remained of a collapsed outbuilding and dragged them inside. He fed and watered the mule with a focused seriousness that made Clara's chest hurt in a way she couldn't quite name. In the afternoon, she went into the bakehouse. She wasn't ready to attempt the oven. She knew that. The crack in the arch needed assessment, and the firebox needed cleaning, and the iron door needed to be freed from its rust before she could do anything else. She knew all of this. But she wanted to understand what she had. She cleaned the oven's face with a damp rag, slowly, carefully. until she could see the material it was made from. The clay was river clay, she thought, mixed with sand and something that looked like ash. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. The construction was layered, outer shell, thermal mass, inner chamber, in a way that suggested someone who understood how heat moved and why it mattered. There was a narrow shelf built into the wall beside the oven. Most of what was on it had been ruined by time. A jar of something that had gone black and unidentifiable, a rusted tin cup, a broken-handled brush. But at the back of the shelf, tucked behind the ruined jar, was a flat tin box with a lid. Clara picked it up. The lid was stuck with corrosion, and it took her a moment to work it open, and when she did, she found inside a thin stack of papers, yellow with age but intact, preserved probably by the tin and by the relative dryness of the bakehouse. The handwriting was difficult, cramped and faded, with spelling that suggested someone who had learned to write from practice rather than instruction. But Clara sat down on the floor with her back against the oven's cold flank and worked at it slowly. "I am Eliza Crow," the first line read. "I write this in case anyone comes after me and finds what I have left." Clara read for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up. Brass padded into the bakehouse doorway and lay down across the threshold, his copper-colored coat just visible in the fading afternoon light, as if he'd decided that doorway was his particular responsibility. Inside, Clara turned a page and kept reading. And outside, the winter kept coming, the way winter always did. Without mercy, without interest in what any particular person needed it to do instead. It didn't know, and wouldn't have cared, that inside a broken building beside a frozen wagon trail, a woman was learning something that would matter more than it had any right to. It was only an oven, it was only a set of old notes. But in the hands of a woman with nothing left to lose, sometimes that was enough. Eliza Crow had not been a patient woman by nature. That was the first thing Clara understood after reading through the notes a second time, more carefully, in the thin gray light of the following morning. The woman who had written these pages had a temper that showed through even in her handwriting. The letters pressed harder when she was frustrated, the lines cramping together when she was working through something that wasn't cooperating. There were crossed-out passages that looked like they'd been crossed out with feeling. There were margins full of corrections and second thoughts. And in one place, what appeared to be a single word written and then obliterated so thoroughly that Clara couldn't make it out at all. But Eliza Crow had learned patience. That was the whole point. That was what the notes were about. "The oven does not care what you want," she had written on the third page. "It only responds to what you do. Rush it, and it punishes you. Treat it like it has its own mind, and it will work with you. That is the only secret I know." Clara set the notes on the shelf and looked at the oven. The iron door was still seized with rust. The crack in the upper arch was still there, a finger-width gap that ran from the crown down about 8 inches before it stopped. The firebox was packed with years of ash and debris, bird nesting material, she thought, and probably mice, and things she'd rather not examine too closely. She had no clay to repair the arch. She had no tools designed for this kind of work. She had a belt knife, a pry bar she'd found in the collapsed outbuilding, a bucket, and 2 hands that were already raw from the cold. She started with what she could do. The firebox took most of the morning. She cleared it by hand in the beginning, removing the packed debris in layers, shaking out the old ash into the bucket and hauling it outside in loads. Noah helped until his fingers went numb, then she sent him to check on the mule and rebuild the fire in the main room, and he went without arguing, which told her his hands were worse than he'd said. Brass sat in the bakehouse doorway and watched her work. "You're not useful," she told him. He wagged once and stayed where he was. By noon she had the firebox cleared down to the original clay floor, which was cracked in places but intact. She found the ash grate under the debris, iron, heavier than she expected, but not rusted through. She cleaned it off and set it back in place. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the crack in the arch. Eliza's notes had addressed this. Not the crack specifically, but the principle behind it. "Clay repairs clay," she had written. "What the oven is made of is what will fix it. Find the right riverbed clay, mix it dry, work it wet, and press it into the damage in layers. Do not rush the drying. The oven will tell you when it is ready by the sound the clay makes when you tap it." Clara read that passage 3 times. Then she put on her coat and went to find the creek. Miller Creek was a quarter-mile back the way they'd come, and in January it was frozen to a depth that made her feel better about having crossed it on the mule. But where the creek bent and the bank undercut, the freeze was thinner, and below the ice she could see the dark color of clay-heavy soil. She broke through with the pry bar and dug out what she needed with her hands, working fast because the water that seeped in from the sides was cold enough to make her fingers stop working properly after about 3 minutes. She carried the clay back in the bucket. She mixed it on the bakehouse floor with a small amount of ash. Eliza had written that ash strengthened the bond, and worked it until it was the consistency she thought she wanted, which was a guess because she had never done anything like this before in her life. She had done a great many things before that she'd never done before. She'd learned to slaughter a hog at 15 from watching once and then doing it herself. She'd learned to set a broken bone, Noah's finger, when he was 7, from a fall, from a description in the almanac that arrived in the mail. She'd learned in the past 6 weeks that she was capable of a level of fear she hadn't previously understood existed, and that she could function through it anyway. She pressed the clay mixture into the crack in small amounts, working from the inside out, smoothing each layer before adding the next. It took her most of the afternoon. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at it. The repair was visible. She hadn't tried to make it invisible, just solid, and she didn't know yet if it would hold. She'd find out when the oven was fired. That was simply the truth of it. "Is it fixed?" Noah said from the doorway. He'd come back from the main room with color in his cheeks and ash on his sleeve. "I think so. We'll find out." "When?" "When the clay is dry. A few days, maybe. Could be longer in this cold." He looked at the oven with an expression she recognized, the careful, measuring look he used when he was trying to calculate whether something was going to work. He'd gotten that from Martin, she thought. Martin had looked at problems the same way. "What do we do if it doesn't work?" he said. "Fix it again." "And if it keeps not working?" Clara turned and looked at him directly. "Then we keep fixing it. That's what we do. We're not leaving." Noah held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he sometimes did, not the nod of a child deferring to an adult, but something more considered than that, the nod of someone who had decided to commit to a direction. "Okay," he said. 4 days passed in a rhythm that was brutal in its demands, but had the virtue of leaving no space for despair. They woke before light. Clara rebuilt the fire in the main hearth while Noah saw to the mule. They ate whatever was practical, cornmeal, mostly, with dried beans when she could get them to cook through in the small iron pot. And then they worked until the light failed and they ate again and slept. The work was the thing that kept her sane. She understood that clearly. As long as there was something to do, something specific and physical that needed doing, the fear stayed at a manageable distance. It was in the moments between tasks that it tried to get in, when she sat down to rest and her mind went to the question of how long the cornmeal would last, or whether the temperature would drop further, or what would happen to Noah if she got sick. She didn't let herself sit still for long. The window frames got repaired properly, first with salvaged boards and then with the oiled canvas she'd traded for at Felk's. 2 sheets of it, enough to cover all 4 openings if she cut them carefully. The door got a second hinge, salvaged from a cabinet she found in what had been a storage room off the main structure, mostly collapsed but with useful bits inside. She patched the worst of the ceiling damage in the main room with boards and packed clay, not because it was a perfect repair, but because it stopped the worst of the cold coming in from above. She found a rusted axe head in the debris pile and spent the better part of an afternoon setting it on a new handle, a straight-grained piece of ash from one of the fallen branches, and sharpening it on the flat river stone she'd brought up from the creek for exactly that purpose. With the axe, she could cut proper firewood instead of relying on deadfall. With proper firewood, the fire in the main hearth could run steady instead of burning hot for an hour and then guttering. On the 5th morning, she tapped the clay repair on the oven arch and listened. It sounded like stone. Not quite like stone. Not yet, but close enough. Dense and settled rather than hollow and loose. She tapped along the edges of the repair and then along the original clay surface beside it, comparing the sounds, feeling the difference. Eliza had written, "When it sounds like it belongs, it belongs." "All right," Clara said quietly, to the oven, or to the memory of the woman who had built it, or to no one. "All right." She built the first fire small. That was the thing Eliza's notes had been most insistent about. The first fire could not be rushed. The oven had been cold and unused for years. The clay had contracted, the stones had settled, the whole thermal mass had adjusted itself to the temperature of a Dakota winter. You couldn't flood that with heat all at once. You had to bring it up slowly, give every component time to expand and shift without cracking. I killed 2 ovens before I understood this, Eliza had written. My impatience cost me both of them. The 3rd oven I built, I started the first fire with wood shavings and fed it so slowly that my husband thought I'd lost my mind. That oven lasted 20 years. Clara used birch bark and the finest shavings she could produce with the belt knife and a piece of the cedar she'd saved. She built a fire the size of her 2 fists put together and fed it almost nothing for the first hour. Just enough to keep it alive. Just enough to let the heat begin its slow conversation with the cold clay. Noah sat in the bakehouse doorway with Brass beside him and watched. After an hour, Clara fed the fire a little more. After 2 hours, more still. She watched the oven's behavior, the way the smoke moved, the way the heat came back out of the chamber when she held her hand near the open mouth. She watched the repair she'd made in the arch and saw no new cracking, no separation, nothing alarming. 3 hours in, she fed the fire properly for the first time. The oven began to warm. It was slow, nothing like the immediate blast of heat from a wood stove, but it was there. She could feel it coming off the face of the oven, a warmth that was somehow deeper than the fire in the main hearth produced, a warmth that felt like it came from the material itself rather than from the surface. It's working, Noah said. Don't say that yet. Why not? Because saying it too soon is asking for trouble. He thought about this. That's superstition. Probably. She didn't move her hand from the oven's face. Doesn't mean I'm wrong, but it was working. She let herself acknowledge that privately, quietly, without saying it out loud. The repair was holding, the oven was warming. Whatever Eliza Crow had built in this bakehouse, all those years ago, was still capable of doing what it had been built to do, Sam. She tried to bake bread on the 8th day, and it went badly. Not catastrophically. The oven didn't crack. The fire didn't do anything unpredictable. But the bread itself was a failure. The dough hadn't risen properly because the temperature in the bakehouse fluctuated too much, and the yeast she'd managed to culture from the dregs of the dried hops she'd brought was weaker than she'd hoped. The loaves came out dense and gummy in the middle and too dark on the outside, and when she cut into the first one, the expression on Noah's face told her everything she needed to know before she tasted it herself. It's all right, he said, which meant it wasn't. It's not, she said. But it's what we have. They ate it anyway. Dense bread was still bread. It just wasn't the bread she needed to be able to make. Not the bread that could keep them alive through the rest of this winter. Not the bread that could give them something to trade. She went back to Eliza's notes. She'd been reading them the way you read instructions, looking for the steps, the sequence, the how-to. But sitting there in the bakehouse with the oven warm and the bread failed and the wind working at the building outside, she read them differently. She read them the way you read a letter from someone who understood something you didn't yet. The yeast does not live in the flour, Eliza had written. It lives in the air and the warmth and the patience of the baker. You cannot force it. You can only make the conditions right and wait for it to decide to work. I have started more than 30 starters in my life and lost half of them to hurry and doubt. Clara read that passage and then sat with it for a while. She thought about the way she'd been approaching the yeast, anxiously, checking it too often, moving it when she should have left it alone, adjusting conditions based on worry rather than observation. She thought about the way Eliza's notes described a kind of attention that wasn't the same as control. Watching for signs rather than forcing outcomes. She started a new starter and didn't look at it for 2 days. On the 3rd day it was alive, properly alive, bubbling and active and smelling the way it was supposed to smell. She fed it and left it alone again. On the 5th day she used it for a new batch of dough. This time the bread rose. Not perfectly. It was still denser than it should have been, still a little uneven in the bake. But it was bread. Real bread. The kind with a crust that had color and a crumb with actual structure. The kind that smelled when she slid it out of the oven like something worth having. Noah came into the bakehouse when the smell reached the main room. He stood looking at the 4 loaves cooling on the board Clara had set on the brick edge of the oven's mouth. That's different, he said. Yes. Can we eat it? After it cools. He waited. He was very good at waiting when the reward was clear. When they finally cut into the first loaf, The crumb pulled apart in a way that made Clara's chest feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something small and specific and genuine. Not happiness exactly. Something more cautious than happiness. A first step in a direction that might lead there. "It's good," Noah said. "It needs work." "Mama." He looked at her. "It's actually good." She looked at the bread. Then she smiled. A brief thing, more private than public. The kind of smile that isn't for anyone else, but can't quite be stopped. "Yeah," she said. "It's getting there." The first traveler came on a Thursday morning in early February, which Clara knew only because Noah had been keeping track on a piece of board with a charcoal mark for each day. She heard the horse before she heard anything else. A single horse, moving at a walk. The particular cadence of an animal that was tired rather than unhurried. She came to the main room doorway and watched through the oiled canvas window as a rider came up the trail and stopped in front of the building. He sat there for a moment, looking at the place, at the smoke coming from the chimney, at the canvas windows, at the repaired door, with an expression of naked surprise that would have been funny under different circumstances. Clara opened the door. It was maybe 50, weathered in the way of men who spent most of their time outdoors, with a coat that had seen better decades and eyes that were bloodshot from wind. His horse had ice in its mane. "I'll be damned," he said. "This place is occupied." "It is." "I thought it had been abandoned for 20 years. "It was. Now it isn't." She looked at him and at the horse. "You need something?" He seemed to recalibrate his understanding of the situation, visibly. "I'm heading to Mandan. Got caught out in last night's blow. I saw the smoke." He hesitated. "Is that bread I smell?" She looked at him for a moment, then she stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold. I'll sell you a loaf." He paid her with a piece of dried venison and 4 pounds of dried corn that he had in his saddlebag, which was, she calculated rapidly, worth more than she'd asked for and more than she'd expected. She wrapped the bread in the cloth she'd brought and handed it over, and he left with his horse watered from the well and his hands wrapped around the warm loaf like it was something he'd been waiting for. He came back the following week with his brother, who left her with a sack of flour. The week after that, 3 different travelers stopped on 3 different days. The word that was traveling, she understood, wasn't a message anyone sent deliberately. It was just the natural movement of information through a place where information was scarce and reliable things were scarcer. Someone had found a lit building on the wagon trail to Mandan, with a working well and a woman who would sell you bread. That was news worth passing on. She raised her prices by the 3rd week. Not greedy prices, fair prices. Prices calibrated to what people actually had and what the bread was worth. Some people paid in coin. More paid in goods. Flour, dried beans, salt. A bolt of wool cloth from a merchant heading west. A jar of rendered lard from a farm wife traveling east. She kept a ledger on the back of one of Eliza's pages. She'd started writing on the clean side, noting each exchange in a hand that was smaller and neater than Eliza's had been. The station was becoming something. It was not yet stable. She knew that. She was still 1 bad week from destitution. 1 week without travelers, 1 bag of flour that turned out to be bad. 1 illness she couldn't work through. The margin she was operating on was thin to the point of transparency. But it was there. And every morning she fired the oven and felt it come to life under her hands. She thought about Eliza Crow. Not as a legend or a model, but as a woman, specifically, with a temper and a husband who thought she was taking too long and a hard-won understanding of a single piece of clay and fire and stone. A woman who had left her notes in a tin box on a shelf, probably not expecting anyone to find them, and who had left them anyway. One afternoon in late February, when the light had shifted just slightly towards something that might eventually become spring. Though it would take its time getting there, Clara was working the dough for the morning's bake when Noah appeared in the bakehouse doorway. "There's a man outside," he said, "different from the travelers." Clara set down the dough. "What do you mean different?" "He's got better clothes, and a horse that's not tired." She wiped her hands on her apron and came through to the main room and looked through the canvas window. The man outside was perhaps 40, with a coat that was clean and a hat that was new, and he was standing back from the building with the assessing expression that she recognized. The expression she'd first seen on the face of the man named Calloway, back in what felt like another lifetime. He was looking at the place the way someone looks at something they're calculating the value of. Clara felt something go cold in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. She opened the door. Mrs. Voss? He said. She didn't answer immediately. Who's asking? He smiled. It was a practiced smile, pleasant, professional, the smile of a man who used it as a tool. My name is Aldrich. I work for Mr. Victor Hale. I believe you and Mr. Hale have met, in a manner of speaking. Brass, who had been lying beside the door, stood up. Clara kept her face still. What does Mr. Hale want? Aldrich looked around at the building, at the smoke coming from the chimney, at the repaired fence line and the new-looking canvas on the windows. Mr. Hale has become aware that you've been operating a commercial enterprise from this location. He paused. He's interested in the property. This property isn't for sale. Mrs. Voss. He said her name with the gentle patience of someone explaining something to a person who hasn't quite understood the situation yet. I don't think you appreciate the full picture. Mr. Hale has done some research into this parcel. The original land grant here was never properly recorded after the station closed. Legally, the property's status is unclear at best. Clara looked at him. I've been here since January. I've repaired the structure. I've operated a business from the premises. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable point that unfortunately didn't change anything. Mr. Hale employs 2 attorneys, Mrs. Voss, and he has friends at the land office in Bismarck who can make the recording process move quickly in the right direction. I'm sure he does. He's prepared to offer you fair compensation for your trouble and your time, enough to get yourself and your son to— No! Aldrich stopped. No, Clara said again. You tell Mr. Hale no. You tell him I said it clearly, so there's no confusion later. This place was abandoned. I found it, I repaired it, and I've been running it as a legitimate operation for 2 months. If Mr. Hale thinks he has a legal claim, he can bring it in front of a judge. Aldrich studied her for a moment. The practiced smile had not entirely gone, but had become something more careful. Mr. Hale may do exactly that, Mrs. Voss. Then that's what he'll do. He looked at the building again. He looked at Brass, who was watching him with the focused attention of an animal that has made its assessment and reached a conclusion. He looked at Clara. I hope you understand what you're getting into, he said. I understand exactly what I'm getting into, she said. I've been understanding it since January. She watched him right away and stood in the doorway long enough to make sure he was gone. Then she went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it and let out a breath that she'd been holding for longer than was probably healthy. Noah came in from the bakehouse. He'd heard, she knew. The walls weren't thick enough to hide much. Was that about the land? He said. Yes. Is he going to try to take it? She looked at her son. His face was calm in the way it got when he was more frightened than he wanted to let on. The careful stillness, the direct look, the deliberate absence of the fidgeting that was his normal state. He's going to try, she said. Victor Hale is going to try. What do we do? She pushed off from the door and crossed the room and picked the ledger up off the table, the careful record she'd been keeping on the back of Eliza's page. Every exchange, every traveler, every repair she'd made, and every person who'd benefited from the station being alive again. We keep doing what we're doing, she said, and we write everything down. Noah looked at the ledger, then he looked at her. Is that going to be enough? Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the ledger, at the repairs, at the life they'd built from wreckage in the worst months of the year in one of the coldest places on the continent. I don't know, she said, but it's what we have, and we're going to make it count. Outside, the wind came down off the northern plain in that particular way it had, like it was deciding something, like it hadn't made up its mind yet about what this winter was going to cost. Clara put the ledger in the cedar box with the rest of her papers and went back to the bakehouse and went back to work. The papers arrived on a Monday. Clara knew they were coming. She'd known since the afternoon Aldrich rode away with his practiced smile and his careful words, since the moment she'd watched his horse disappear around the bend in the trail and felt the particular cold of understanding settle into her chest. Victor Hale was not a man who made suggestions. He was a man who sent people to make suggestions, and when those suggestions were declined, he moved to the next instrument in his possession. The instrument in this case was a man named Dowd, county land agent, arriving on horseback with 2 riders behind him and a document case under his arm that he carried with the self-important care of someone who wanted you to understand that what was inside it mattered. Clara saw them from the bakehouse window while she was working the morning's second batch of dough. She didn't stop working. She watched them ride up, watched Dowd dismount with the stiff-legged motion of a man who'd been in the saddle too long and wasn't in good enough shape for it, and she kept her hands moving in the dough until she heard the knock on the door. Noah appeared in the bakehouse doorway. "3 men," he said. "I see them." "You want me to—" "Stay in here." She pulled her hands out of the dough and wiped them on her apron. "Don't come out unless I call you." She went to the door and opened it before Dowd could knock again. He was a small man with the kind of neatly trimmed mustache that men grew when they wanted to look more authoritative than they felt. He had the document case open before she'd fully registered his face. "Mrs. Voss, I'm Hugh Dowd, county land agent for Morton County. I'm here to serve notice of a land claim proceeding initiated by Hale Freight and Land with regard to this property." He held out a folded document. "This is your official notification. You have 30 days to respond through proper legal channels or vacate the premises." Clara took the document. She unfolded it and read it, standing there in the doorway with the cold coming in around her, taking her time despite the fact that Dowd shifted his weight impatiently, and one of his riders made a small sound that was probably meant to communicate that this was a formality and she shouldn't bother reading carefully. She read carefully. The language was dense and full of references to statutes she didn't know, but the shape of it was clear enough. Victor Hale was claiming that the property had been abandoned without proper legal resolution, that the original land grant had lapsed, and that he had filed to have the parcel recognized under his existing land holdings in the territory. The 30-day notice was, she understood, a courtesy, the kind of courtesy that was extended not out of any genuine consideration, but because the law required it. "Who's the presiding official for the proceeding?" she said. Dowd blinked. He hadn't expected that question, which told her something. "The claim will be heard by Land Commissioner Beaufort out of Bismarck. And Mr. Beaufort is acquainted with Mr. Hale, I assume." Dowd's expression shifted just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "Commissioner Beaufort is a duly appointed official of the territory." "That's not what I asked." One of the riders made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and turned it into a cough. Dowd shot him a look, and then looked back at Clara with the expression of a man who wanted to move on. "You have 30 days, Mrs. Voss. I'd encourage you to use them wisely." "Thank you, Mr. Dowd." She stepped back and closed the door. She stood with the document in her hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to the table, set it down, and went back to the bakehouse to finish the bread. Noah was waiting exactly where she'd left him. "Well?" "We have 30 days to respond to a land claim." "What does that mean?" "It means Victor Hale has filed legal papers." She picked up the dough and started working it again. "It means we need someone who understands the law." Noah was quiet. They both knew what that meant in practical terms. A lawyer in Mandan or Bismarck cost money they didn't have, and the 30-day clock was running regardless of whether they could pay one. "There's the man," Noah said after a moment. "The one who stopped last week. The one with the spectacles who ate 2 whole loaves." Clara stopped working the dough. She thought about the man Noah meant, a traveler who'd come through heading east, who'd sat in the main room for an hour warming himself, and who'd talked more than most of her customers, who'd mentioned in passing that he'd been a clerk in a legal office in Ohio before he'd come west for reasons he didn't specify. A man named Garrett, who'd paid in coin and left her his full name written in the back of the ledger when she mentioned she might want to contact him. She hadn't thought much about it at the time. She'd written down every traveler's name and destination because Eliza's notes had mentioned, in one of the later pages, that knowing who had passed through a place was a form of record that mattered. She went to the cedar box and got the ledger and found the entry. Garrett W.H., heading to Mandan, staying at the Continental Hotel. "He might not still be there," she said. "He might be." She looked at the document on the table. 30 days. "Go saddle the mule," she said. But she couldn't leave the station unattended. There were travelers expected, and more practically, the oven needed tending. So she left Noah in charge of both and rode to Mandan alone, which was the kind of decision that would have seemed unthinkable 4 months ago and now simply seemed necessary. The ride was 9 miles on a trail that had been beaten down enough by winter traffic to be passable, and the temperature was cold but not brutal, somewhere in the upper single digits, with the wind behaving itself for once. Brass ran alongside her for the first 3 miles before she told him firmly to go back, which he ignored, but he eventually fell back on his own around mile 5, apparently deciding that he'd made his point about not being left behind. She found Garrett at the Continental Hotel, not in his room but in the small dining area off the lobby, eating a late breakfast with the concentrated attention of a man who liked his food and wasn't going to rush it for anyone. He looked up when she came in and registered her with a look of surprise that shifted quickly into something more alert. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "from the station." "Yes." She sat down across from him without being invited, which seemed to please rather than bother him. "I need to ask you something." He put down his fork. "Ask." She laid the document on the table between them. He picked it up and read it with the speed of someone practiced at processing legal language, his eyes moving down the page in the particular focused way of a person who knows what they're looking for and where it's likely to be. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Victor Hale," he said. "You know him?" "Of him. Most people in the territory know of him." He picked up his coffee cup. "He has a habit of finding properties in ambiguous legal situations and resolving that ambiguity in his own favor. He's very good at it. I need to know if I have a case." Garrett looked at her over the rim of his cup. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read. Not cold exactly, but careful. The face of someone who had learned to think before speaking. "Tell me exactly what you found when you arrived at that property. Everything. What state it was in, what you did, who has come through since." She told him. All of it. The collapsed roof section, the oven, the well, the repairs she'd made one by one over 2 months, the travelers, the ledger, the trade records. She told him about Eliza Crow's notes and the tin box and the careful record she'd kept of every exchange. She told him about Aldrich's visit and what Aldrich had said about the land recording being unclear. Garrett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his cup. "The doctrine of adverse possession," he said, "is recognized in the territory. You've occupied the land, made improvements, operated it openly, and have done so for a continuous period. That's the basis of a claim." "Is 2 months enough?" 2 months isn't usually sufficient for a full adverse possession claim, no. But that may not be the only argument available to you. He tapped the document. Hale's filing is based on the assertion that the original grant lapsed without resolution. If you can demonstrate that the land was never properly surrendered, that there was an original grantee whose heirs or successors have a legitimate interest, that complicates his claim. "I don't know who originally held this property." "The woman whose notes you found, Eliza Crow." He said the name as if testing it. "Do you know anything about her history? Whether she had family? What happened to her?" Clara thought about the notes. The cramped handwriting, the crossed-out passages, the single obliterated word in the margin. The last page of the notes had been different from the others. Shorter, the handwriting less controlled, dated in a winter that had been, by her rough calculation, sometime in the late 1860s. "I am leaving this place," the last page began. "I do not go willingly. The weather has beaten me this season in a way I have not been beaten before, and my husband says we cannot stay another winter. He is probably right. I have said before that patience was the lesson the oven taught me. Perhaps there is another lesson, which is knowing when a fight is finished. I have not learned that lesson yet, but I'm going anyway." Clara had read that page so many times she could recall it without effort. "She left," she said. "She wrote that the winter beat her. She and her husband left the station." "When?" "I think sometime around 1868, maybe 1869. "And the land was never sold or formally surrendered after that?" "Apparently not, based on what Hale's man said. He said the original grant was never properly recorded after the station closed." Garrett was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "If the grant was never resolved, there may be outstanding heirs. If Eliza Crow had children, and those children or their descendants can be located, they have a prior claim that supersedes Hale's." He paused. "It's a long shot, but it's a different argument than adverse possession, and combined with your record of improvements and operation, it may be enough to delay the proceeding and force a proper hearing." Clara looked at the document on the table. "I have 30 days. "Yes," he met her eyes. "I'm not a licensed attorney in this territory. I was a clerk. I can help you understand the language and prepare a response, but I can't represent you in a proceeding. Can you help me find someone who can?" He picked up his fork again, seemingly having made a decision about something. "I know a woman in Bismarck, an attorney named Hedda Marsh. She's one of the only women practicing law in the territory, which means she's accustomed to people underestimating what she can do. And she charges fair rates. I can write you a letter of introduction. Clara thought about fair rates and what she had in the cedar box and what was coming in from the bread and whether it would be enough. How much time do I have before I need to be in Bismarck? If you leave within the week, you'll have time for a proper consultation before you need to file a response. He looked at her directly. Mrs. Voss, I want to say something, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's meant. She waited. Hale is not going to stop. Even if this proceeding fails, he'll find another angle. He's a patient man when patience serves him, and he has resources that most people he goes up against don't have. He paused. I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it so that you go into this with your eyes open. My eyes have been open since January, she said. Write me the letter. She was back at the station by nightfall, cold to the bone and with a letter for Hedda Marsh in her coat pocket, and she found Noah had managed a full day's baking and 2 sets of travelers without incident, which relieved her more than she let on. Over the next week, the work of survival continued in parallel with the work of fighting. She baked in the mornings and corresponded in the afternoons. Garrett had given her paper and an envelope, and she wrote out, in careful detail, everything she had told him and everything he had suggested she compile. She went through the ledger entry by entry, organized the trade records by date, and wrote a separate account of each structural repair she'd made with the approximate date and the materials used. She had no witnesses to most of this work, which was a problem she acknowledged in the letter to Hedda Marsh without trying to minimize it. She did have one thing she hadn't thought of immediately as evidence: the travelers themselves. They kept coming. By March, the station had developed a reputation along the trail that Clara hadn't entirely planned for and couldn't have manufactured. Word among the people who moved through that part of the territory that the old Crow station was operating again, that the bread was worth stopping for, that the well was reliable, and the woman running the place would deal fairly. 3 or 4 people a week, sometimes more on days when the trail was busy. She began asking, carefully, whether any of them would be willing to put their names to a statement about what they had seen at the station and when. Most agreed without hesitation, not out of any particular allegiance to Clara, but because frontier people understood practically and viscerally what it meant to have a reliable stop on a long trail in winter, and they understood what would happen to that stop if Hale took the property. She was compiling a stack of signed statements when the letter came from Bismarck. It was from Hedda Marsh, and it was concise in the way that told Clara the woman had thought carefully about how to use words before she put them on paper. Your situation has 2 significant complications, the letter read. The first is the 30-day timeline, which is shorter than I would like for a thorough response. The second is Commissioner Beaufort, who has a relationship with Hale Freight and Land that I would characterize as financially intertwined. A proceeding heard by Beaufort will not be impartial. Clara read that paragraph twice, feeling the cold certainty of it. However, the letter continued, I have found something in the territorial land records that Mr. Hale's attorneys may not have found, or may have found and chosen not to disclose. The original Crow Station land grant, issued in 1861, was made to a grantee named Thomas Crow. Thomas Crow died in 1871. His estate was never probated in this territory, but I have located a reference to a daughter, one Margaret Crow, later Margaret Alderman, who relocated to Minnesota in the early 1870s. If Margaret Alderman or her heirs can be located and will execute an assignment of their interest in the property to you, Hale's claim becomes substantially more difficult to prosecute. Clara sat down. She read the letter again. Then she sat very still for a long time. Thomas Crow, Eliza Crow's husband, the man who had said, in the winter of 1868 or 1869, that they couldn't stay another year. The man who had probably been the one to let the legal status of the property drift unresolved, because resolving it cost money and effort, and the winter had beaten them, and sometimes when a thing is over, you just go. She thought about Eliza's last page. He is probably right. I have not learned that lesson yet. But I'm going anyway. Thomas had been right, and the property he'd left behind unresolved had become the thing Clara was now fighting to keep. She wrote back to Hedda Marsh that evening. She agreed to the attorney's fees, which were substantial enough that she would need to borrow against future bread income to cover them, and asked Hedda to begin locating Margaret Alderman or her heirs immediately. She didn't tell Noah about the letter that night. She wasn't ready to explain the full complexity of it, the long chain of accident and neglect and human decision that had created this particular legal knot, to a 10-year-old, and she wasn't ready to put the hope of it into words out loud, where it might turn fragile. She went to the bakehouse and stood in front of the oven and let herself feel the warmth coming off its face in that deep, patient way that it had. Not the sharp heat of a quick fire, but the sustained, considered warmth of a thermal mass that had been properly built and properly tended. She thought about Eliza Crow, who had learned patience from this same oven and then been beaten by a winter anyway and left. She thought about what it would mean if Margaret Alderman was dead, if there were no heirs, if the thread that Hedda Marsh had found led nowhere. She thought about Victor Hale and his attorneys and Commissioner Beaufort and the particular way powerful men move through the world. Not rushing, exactly, but with the settled confidence of people who know that time and resources work in their favor. She pressed both palms flat against the oven's face. The clay was warm and solid and exactly what it was. The blizzard started on a Wednesday in the third week of March, which should have been too late in the season for a storm of that magnitude, but wasn't, because the weather in Dakota Territory had no interest in what should have been. Clara had seen it building for 2 days, the barometric pressure doing something she'd learned to read from a sky that went flat and pale in a particular way, the wind shifting direction twice in 12 hours. The animals becoming uncomfortable and restless in the manner of creatures whose bodies registered what human instruments often missed. She'd spent those 2 days preparing, filling every container she had with water from the well, cutting and stacking firewood against the interior wall of the main room until there was a full quart of it, checking the oven and the main hearth and the repairs on the windows and the door. She'd also done something she hadn't been sure about until she did it. She'd taken the cedar box and wrapped it in the waterproof canvas and put it in the highest, driest place she could find in the main room, a shelf she'd built against the solid west wall. Because if the roof went in this storm, she was not going to lose those papers. The storm hit in the night. She knew it was bad before she was fully awake. The sound of it was different from any of the storms that had come through since January, a bass register to the wind that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She got up and checked the windows and the door and rebuilt the fires in both the main hearth and the bakehouse, feeding them more generously than usual, because if the temperature outside was what she thought it was, they were going to need the heat. Noah slept through the first 2 hours, which she was grateful for. When he woke around 3 in the morning, the wind was doing something to the building that she would have called shaking if she'd wanted to be accurate about it. He came and sat beside her at the main hearth without speaking, wrapped in his blanket, brass pressed against his side. "How bad is it?" he said. "Bad." "Is the building okay?" She listened to the sounds the structure was making, the creaking in the repaired roof section, the particular percussion of the window canvas under pressure, and made her best assessment. "It's holding." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "The oven?" "I fired it before I went to sleep. It'll stay warm even if the fire in the firebox burns down." He thought about this with the careful attention he gave to technical problems. "How long can it hold heat?" Eliza wrote that a properly fired oven holds baking temperature for 6 to 8 hours after the fire is pulled. The thermal mass keeps it. "What if the storm goes longer than that?" "Then we refire when we need to." They sat together listening to the storm work at the building. It wasn't comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people attending closely to a situation that required attention. But it wasn't frightened silence either. Or not only that. There was something else in it that Clara found she didn't have a precise word for. A kind of compressed togetherness, maybe. The particular proximity of people who are facing something from the same side. The knock on the door came around 4 in the morning. Clara was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. Nobody knocked on a door in a blizzard at 4 in the morning unless they were in genuine trouble. She got the beam off the door and opened it against the wind's resistance and found 2 people on the other side. A man and a woman, both so covered in snow and ice that she couldn't make out their faces. The woman barely upright, the man holding her with both arms. "We were on the trail," the man said. His voice was strange, thick with cold, the words not coming out cleanly. "The horses—" He stopped. "I don't know where the horses went. We walked. I saw your light." Clara stepped back. "Get inside." They came in. The woman, once the snow was off her and she was in the firelight, turned out to be young, younger than Clara had expected, maybe 22, with the blank fixed look of someone whose body had been consuming its reserves for too long. The man was older, her father perhaps, with frost in his beard and hands that had gone white at the fingertips. "Noah," Clara said, "get the blankets. Get the pot on the hearth." He moved. Clara got both of them to the floor by the fire and began working on the woman's hands first, not rubbing, which she knew from what she'd read was the wrong instinct, but warming slowly, gradually, covering the hands between her own palms and letting the heat transfer at a rate the tissue could manage. "What's your name?" she said to the woman. The woman blinked. Nora Sellers." "All right, Nora, you're going to be all right." "My father, he's here. He's warming." Over the next hour, she worked on both of them, warming, watching, feeding them the thin bean soup she had on the fire, and then bread when it was clear they could manage solid food. The man's name was Gil Sellers. They'd been 3 days on the trail from the east, pushing to make Mandan before a family situation that he mentioned and then didn't elaborate on. "We saw the light in your window," Gil said, his words coming more clearly now that the cold was leaving him. "I didn't know the station was operating, thought it was abandoned." "It was," Clara said. "It isn't anymore." He looked around the room, at the repaired walls, the wood stacked against the west wall, the solid hearth holding a proper fire, the bread cooling on the board by the bake. "You did all this yourself?" "My son helped." He was quiet for a moment, then, "There were 2 other groups on the trail behind us, maybe a half-mile back when the storm hit hard." Clara looked at the door. The wind outside was doing what it had been doing for 3 hours now, testing, pushing, working at every weak point with the methodical determination of something that had no other purpose. "Noah," she said, "take the lantern and hang it on the fence post by the trail, highest you can reach." He looked at her. He was 10 years old and the storm outside was not a joke. "I'll tie a rope to you," she said. "You go out, hang the lantern, and come straight back. Don't stop. Don't look at anything. The rope comes back with you." He picked up the lantern without arguing. She tied one end of the mule's lead rope around his waist and held the other end herself, and he went out into the blizzard, and she felt the rope pay out in her hands and watched the light of the lantern diminish in the white dark outside the door, and she did not let herself think about what she would do if the wind took him off his feet. The rope stopped paying out. A long moment. Then it began to come back. He came through the door with ice in his eyelashes and his face entirely blank with cold, and she closed the door and held him until he stopped shaking, and neither of them said anything. Within the hour, there were 7 people sheltering in the station. The second group from the trail was 4 men. Trappers heading back from the north with a winter's take, practical men who shook the snow off themselves and asked what they could do to help before they'd even fully thawed. The third group was a family, a man named Howell, his wife, and a girl of about 7 who arrived attached to her mother's coat and did not let go for several hours. Clara ran the oven through the night. She baked everything she had flour for, 6 loaves, then 4 more with the emergency sack she'd been saving. And she fed them all and kept the fires burning and organized the men who were capable into a rotation of checking the structure and the firewood situation. By dawn, there were 12 people in the station, and the storm was showing no sign of stopping. The little girl, her name turned out to be Rose, had finally let go of her mother's coat and was sitting near the oven with Brass, who had appointed himself her personal guardian in the way that he occasionally appointed himself guardian of people he'd apparently decided needed it. She was feeding him pieces of bread crust with the solemn generosity of a child doing something important. Clara watched them from the bakehouse doorway. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past the point where exhaustion felt like a specific sensation and become more like the general condition of her existence. Gil Sellers came and stood beside her. "This oven," he said. "You fire it yourself?" "Yes." "Every day?" "Every day." I was quiet for a moment. "My wife's brother is a merchant, runs a dry goods operation out of Mandan. He was complaining last month about how there was nowhere reliable between here and the eastern settlements for travelers to stop." He paused. "I'm going to tell him about this place." Clara looked at the oven. At the people arranged around it and the main hearth, warming and fed and alive, because the oven was burning and had been burning since January because a woman named Eliza Crow had built it right 50 years ago and had left her notes for someone who came after. "Tell him he's welcome," she said. Outside, the blizzard kept going. Inside, the oven kept burning, and in Bismarck, in a legal office Clara had never seen, a woman named Hedda Marsh was looking at a land record from 1861, following a thread toward a woman named Margaret Alderman, while a land commissioner named Beaufort was signing papers that Victor Hale's attorneys had placed in front of him, and neither of them knew yet which thread would pull harder. Clara went back to the firebox and added wood, and the oven took it, and the heat spread through the clay in the slow, thorough way that it had, the way that no amount of rushing could speed up and no amount of neglect could entirely destroy. Patient, she thought. The way you learned to be patient when you had no other choice. She'd been learning that lesson since January. She wasn't done learning it yet. The blizzard broke on a Friday morning, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost aggressive after 3 days of wind that had made the walls vibrate. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at what the storm had done to the world. The fence line was gone under the drifts. The trail had disappeared entirely, replaced by a smooth white expanse that showed no evidence of ever having been traveled. The cottonwood stand to the north had lost 2 trees. She could see them down, their root systems exposed like dark hands reaching out of the snow. The station had held. The east roof section, the one she'd repaired with boards and packed clay back in January, had held. The windows had held. The door had held. There was new water damage along the top of the north wall where the snow load had found a gap she hadn't known existed, and she'd need to address that before the next rain. But the structure was standing and the oven was burning, and 12 people had spent 3 days inside this building and were all alive. That was the accounting. She stood in the cold morning air and took it in. Gil Sellers came and stood beside her. He'd been useful during the storm in the quiet, competent way of a man who didn't offer opinions about how things should be done, but simply did what needed doing when something needed doing. He'd helped her manage the firewood rotation and had taken a 2-hour watch at 3 in the morning so she could sleep. "Trail will be passable in a day or 2, he said. "Snow's dry enough it'll pack down quick." "Yes." He looked at the drifts. "That family. The Howells. Their wagon's under 6 feet of snow somewhere south of here. The horses made it back to the station on their own." He paused. "They've got nowhere to go until the trail opens." "They can stay." He glanced at her sideways. "You're going to run out of flour." "The trappers have supplies. They offered to contribute before you were awake." He was quiet for a moment. "You run this place like you've been doing it for 30 years. Clara almost said something dismissive. Instead, she said, "I've been doing it for 2 months. It just feels like 30 years. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I meant it as a compliment." "I know, thank you." The Sellers family left the following day when the trail was passable enough for foot traffic. The trappers left the same morning, 2 of them having lent their horses to the Howell family to get to Mandan. The family with the little girl, Rose, who had eventually released Brass from her personal guardianship, but only after extracting from him what appeared to be a mutual agreement about bread crusts, left on the 3rd day after the storm, the father shaking Clara's hand with both of his, and the mother pressing $3 silver into her palm without saying anything, just meeting her eyes for a moment in the particular way of a woman who understood what had happened in this building over 3 days and didn't have words for it either. Clara put the silver dollars in the cedar box. She did the accounting that evening, sitting at the table with the ledger open. The storm had cost her flour, beans, salt pork, firewood, at a rate she hadn't planned for. But the trappers had left a full sack of cornmeal and 2 pounds of dried venison. Gil Sellers had pressed money into her hand on his way out. Not the transaction of a customer, but the gesture of a man paying a debt he understood he owed. The Howell family had left their remaining travel provisions, which included a half-pound of coffee and a tin of molasses that Clara held in her hands for a moment before putting carefully away. The numbers, when she added them up, were not as bad as she'd feared. They were still thin. They were still the kind of numbers that required everything to go reasonably right for the next month to be workable. But they were not the numbers of a woman who had just been ruined. She closed the ledger and became aware that she hadn't heard Noah in a while. She found him in the bakehouse, sitting on the floor with his back against the oven and Eliza's notes in his lap. He was reading the last page, the one Clara had read so many times that she knew it without looking, with the concentrated frown he got when something was working on him below the level of words. "I didn't know you'd read those," she said. "You left them on the shelf." He looked up. "She sounds sad. At the end." She was. She didn't want to go. But she went anyway. "Yes." He looked back at the page. Do you think she knew someone would find them? Clara thought about that. She leaned against the bakehouse doorframe and considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Not just the quick answer, but the real one. I think she hoped someone would, she said finally. I think that's why she put them in the tin box instead of just leaving them loose. She made them harder to lose. Noah was quiet for a moment. If we lose the property to Hale, we're not going to. But if we did, he looked at her steadily. Would you do what she did? Just go? It was a real question. He wasn't being difficult or testing her. He was asking because he needed to know the answer. Because at 10 years old, he was trying to understand what the options actually were and what his mother was actually capable of, and how much of what she said about not surrendering was true, and how much was the kind of thing adults said to keep children from being afraid. She came and sat down on the floor beside him, which she didn't do often because the floor was cold and her knees didn't love it, but this particular conversation required being at the same level. No, she said. I wouldn't just go. Not without using every legal option available. Not without making them prove every piece of their claim in front of a judge who isn't in Hale's pocket. And if we lost anyway? After all that? She took a breath. Then I'd find something else. I'd do what I did in January. I'd look at what was in front of me and figure out what it could be used for. He considered this. That's not really an answer. I know. She looked at the oven. It's the honest version of the answer. He handed her Eliza's notes. She took them and held them, feeling the slight brittleness of the old paper, the way it had survived in the tin box for decades by virtue of not being exposed to what would have destroyed it. Then she heard hoofbeats outside. The rider was a woman. That registered first before Clara had fully processed anything else. The particular way the figure sat the horse, upright and deliberate, a kind of purposeful composure that suggested someone who had chosen this posture rather than simply fallen into it. She was maybe 45, with a plain wool coat and no-nonsense boots, and dark eyes that took in the station and its surroundings with a quick, assessing efficiency before settling on Clara. Mrs. Voss, she said. Not a question. Yes. Hedda Marsh. She dismounted without waiting for an invitation and tied her horse to the repaired fence post. I wrote to you from Bismarck. I apologize for arriving unannounced. The letter I sent explaining my plans was almost certainly delayed by the storm. Clara stared at her. You came from Bismarck? After the blizzard? The day after it broke. The trail was manageable. Hedda looked at the station again, more slowly this time. I needed to see the property in person before the hearing. I've been practicing law for 18 years, Mrs. Voss, and I've learned that reading about a place and standing in it are two different kinds of understanding. She said it the way someone states a professional principle, not a personal philosophy, and Clara found herself recalibrating her understanding of this woman rapidly and with something that felt like relief. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. It was the first real coffee she'd made in weeks, from the tin the Howell family had left. She made it strong and brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from Hedda Marsh, while Noah diplomatically took himself to the bakehouse with Brass. Hedda had a document case, smaller and less theatrical than Dowd's had been, and she opened it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who did not consider the act of presenting documents to be a performance. The hearing has been moved, she said. That's the first thing you need to know. Commissioner Beaufort has recused himself. Clara set down her cup. Why? Because I filed a motion pointing out his financial relationship with Hale Freight and Land, and suggesting that the territorial governor's office might find it interesting reading. Hedda took a sip of her coffee. Beaufort has political ambitions. He recused himself within 4 days. Who's the new commissioner? A man named Aldous Price. He's out of Fargo, no prior relationship with Hale that I've been able to find, and a reputation for being careful and slow and genuinely aggravating to people who want things done quickly in their own favor. She allowed herself a brief, dry expression that wasn't quite a smile. I regard those qualities as promising. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not quite relief yet, because she'd been through enough in the past months to know that things shifting in a better direction was not the same thing as things being resolved. But something. Margaret Alderman, she said. Hedda opened a different section of her document case. Margaret Crow Alderman, born 1855, relocated to Minnesota in 1872. She died in 1901. She paused. She had 2 children, a son who died young, and a daughter, Ruth Alderman, now Ruth Alderman Kepler, living in Rochester, Minnesota, age 43. Clara stared at her. You found her? I found her. Hedda set down the page. She was not aware that her grandmother's property in Dakota Territory had never been legally resolved. When I explained the situation to her by letter, she was— Hedda paused, choosing her word carefully. Interested. What does that mean? It means she wants to know more before she decides anything. It also means she hasn't been contacted by Hale's attorneys yet, which tells me they either didn't look as carefully as I did or found her and decided the complication wasn't worth pursuing. Hedda looked at Clara directly. I need you to understand something. Ruth Kepler has a legitimate inherited interest in this property. If she chooses to assert that interest, it creates a prior claim that substantially undermines Hale's filing. But she is under no obligation to assign that interest to you rather than pursuing it herself, or selling it to Hale, or doing nothing with it. The implications arranged themselves in Clara's mind with the unhurried thoroughness of a problem that had been patient about making itself understood. You're saying she could take the property from me as easily as Hale could? Legally, yes, though the circumstances would be somewhat different. Hedda wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I've written to her explaining what you've done here. The repairs, the operation, the people you've sheltered. I've been honest about the legal situation. What I need to know from you is whether you're willing to make a direct appeal to her, to explain yourself in your own words. Write her a letter, you mean? I mean, go to Rochester and meet her in person. Hedda looked at her steadily. Letters get misread, Mrs. Voss. They get interpreted through whatever mood the reader is in when they open them, and you have no ability to respond or clarify. A face-to-face meeting is a different kind of argument. Clara thought about Rochester, Minnesota. She thought about the trail to Mandan and the stage to Bismarck, and from Bismarck, the possibility of a train. She thought about the station and the oven and the daily bread and the travelers coming through and what would happen if she left for a week. The hearing is when? She said. 6 weeks. And if I don't go to Rochester? Then we make the best case we can with the documentation you have. Hedda was quiet for a moment. It may be enough. The signed statements from the travelers are strong. Your repair records are thorough, but Hale has 2 good attorneys and a filing that has the superficial shape of a legitimate claim, and without Ruth Kepler's cooperation, we're arguing that you deserve the property based on the work you've done rather than on the legal chain of title. She paused. Which is the morally correct argument. It is not always the legally sufficient one. Clara looked at the table. She looked at the cedar box on the shelf, where the ledger was, where Eliza's notes were, where the signed statements from 14 travelers were folded and stacked in the order she'd received them. Noah can manage the station for a week, she said. He's been doing half the work since January. Hedda looked at her. He's 10. He's capable. Clara met her eyes. And I don't have another option. Chet. She left 3 days later, on the first stage to Bismarck, which she caught from Mandan at 5 in the morning in the dark and the cold. Noah stood outside the station with Brass beside him and watched her go with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral, and she almost reconsidered twice in the half-mile between the station and the trailhead. She didn't reconsider. She kept walking. Bismarck to Rochester was a 2-day journey by rail, with a change in St. Paul, and Clara spent most of it in a state of preparation that looked, from the outside, like stillness. She went over what she intended to say to Ruth Kepler. She went over it again. She thought about the places where her argument was weak and the places where it was strong, and the difference between what was legally persuasive and what was humanly true, and she tried to figure out which one she was actually going to lead with. She arrived in Rochester in the early morning of the 3rd day, found the address Hedda had provided, and stood outside a modest 2-story house on a quiet street, and took a breath that turned to vapor in the cold air. Then she knocked. Ruth Alderman Kepler was a compact, sharp-eyed woman with her gray-streaked hair pinned up in a practical arrangement and the manner of someone who had learned to read situations quickly and didn't waste time on preamble. She looked at Clara on her doorstep for a moment and then stood back from the door. "You'd better come in," she said. The house was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking. Bread, Clara identified automatically. The smell of a kitchen that was used properly. Ruth led her to a sitting room and brought coffee without asking and sat across from her with the settled composure of a woman who'd been thinking about this meeting since Hedda's letter arrived. My grandmother left Dakota Territory when I was not yet born, Ruth said. My mother spoke of her rarely and of that place less. I knew the story in outline. The station, the oven, the bad winter that finally beat them. She looked at Clara. I did not know the property was in a legal limbo all this time. Neither did I until my attorney found it. No. Ruth held her coffee cup. Tell me about the oven. It was not the question Clara had prepared for, and she said so, which seemed to please Ruth in some way she didn't explain. So Clara told her about the oven. Not the legal version of it, not the evidence version, but the actual version. The cracked arch and the river clay repair. The first small fire that she'd fed almost nothing for an hour. The first bread that had failed and the second batch that hadn't. The notes in the tin box on the shelf. The way the thermal mass held heat in the deep, patient way that no quick fire could replicate. Ruth listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't shift much, but something in her posture changed. A slight softening, or maybe a slight sharpening. Clara couldn't decide which. She left those notes deliberately, Ruth said when Clara had finished. My mother said she was like that, Eliza. She planned for contingencies. She didn't like leaving things unresolved. A pause. The fact that the legal status of the land was left unresolved was my grandfather's doing, not hers. She would have hated knowing that. The notes are well preserved, Clara said. I've handled them carefully. They're in the cedar box with my other papers. Ruth looked at her steadily. You didn't come here just to tell me about the oven. No, I came to tell you that what your grandmother built is still standing and still working, and that I've spent 4 months of hard work making sure it stays that way, and that there's a man named Victor Hale who wants to take it and turn it into something that will benefit no one on that trail except Victor Hale. Clara met her eyes. I'm asking you to assign your inherited interest in the property to me. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking because the law has a mechanism for this, and I want to use it properly. And what do I receive in exchange? My attorney drafted a document, a reasonable consideration, a sum I'll pay you over 5 years from the proceeds of the station's operation. Clara placed the envelope Hedda had prepared on the table between them. It's not what the property is worth if Hale gets it and develops it, but it's what I can honestly offer, and it's real, and you'll receive every payment on the date it's due. Ruth looked at the envelope without touching it. Mrs. Voss, she said, I'm going to tell you something that isn't legally relevant, but that I want you to understand. She paused. My mother grew up in Minnesota with a woman who spent the rest of her life missing a place she'd been beaten out of. Eliza Crow was not a woman who gave up things easily, and she never made her peace with leaving that station. My mother watched that. Ruth looked at her. I have no interest in that property being in Victor Hale's hands. I had no interest in that before you came to my door. Clara didn't let herself move. Then you'll sign. I'll sign. Ruth reached out and picked up the envelope. But I want one thing beyond what's in here. Tell me. The notes. When you're done with them. When the legal matter is resolved and you have no more need of them as evidence, I want you to make a fair copy and send it to me. She held Clara's gaze. I want to know what she knew, what she figured out, what she thought the oven was trying to teach her. Clara thought about the cramped handwriting and the crossed-out passages and the obliterated word in the margin and the last page that ended with, I am going anyway. I'll make the copy myself, she said, and I'll send it with a letter of my own. Ruth nodded. She set the envelope down and stood. I'll need to have my own attorney review this before I sign. It'll take 2 days. I have time, Clara said. And then, because it was true, I've learned to wait. She was back at the station on the 8th day, 2 days before she'd told Noah she'd return because she'd caught an earlier stage and hadn't wanted to lose the time. She came up the trail in the late afternoon and saw smoke from the chimney and the lantern lit in the window and Brass running toward her from 50 yards out with the unhinged enthusiasm of an animal for whom 2 weeks had felt like an abandonment. Noah appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face, and she watched him read it the way he'd always been able to read her, quickly, accurately, without being taught. It went well, he said. It went well. He exhaled something that wasn't quite a sound. Did she sign? She's signing. Hedda will have the documents within the week. She came through the door and stood in the warmth of the main room, which was warm in the specific way it got when the oven had been burning all day, and the heat had moved through the bakehouse wall into the adjacent space. You kept the oven going. Every day? He said it with a straightforwardness that didn't ask for praise, which was exactly the right tone. I ran low on flour by day 4. Gil Seller's brother-in-law, the merchant you mentioned, he sent a delivery, said to put it on account. Clara stopped. He sent a delivery with a letter, saying he wanted to discuss a regular supply arrangement. Noah reached to the shelf and handed her the letter. She read it standing there in her coat, still cold from the trail. The merchant's name was Denton Foyle, and his letter was brief and practical. The letter of a businessman who didn't have patience for ornamentation. He'd heard about the station from Gil Sellers. I understood the operation. A way stop on the trail, reliable bread and water, shelter for travelers in difficult conditions. He was proposing a monthly flour and grain delivery in exchange for a percentage of the trade income from travelers who mentioned Foyle's store as a referral. It was, Clara understood, the difference between surviving and having a foundation. She folded the letter and put it in the cedar box. "You did well," she told Noah. He shrugged in the way he did when he was pleased about something but wasn't going to make a production of it. The Howell family stopped on their way back east, brought a sack of potatoes. He paused. Rose wanted to know if Brass was still here. "What did you tell her?" "I told her he was." She seemed relieved. He looked at her. "What happens now, with Hale?" Clara took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door and stood for a moment in the warmth of the room, feeling it settle around her. "Now," she said, "we go to the hearing." She crossed to the bakehouse doorway and looked at the oven. The fire was banked low. Noah had learned, without being instructed, the difference between a fire you left overnight and a fire you fed continuously. And the clay face of the oven radiated the particular warmth that she'd come to understand was not just heat, but something more specific than that. The warmth of a thing that had been built right and maintained right and asked to do what it was made to do. It hadn't asked her for anything she couldn't give. It had only asked her to pay attention. She thought about Victor Hale in his offices in Mandan, with his attorneys and his land filings and his planned uses for a property he'd never stood inside, had never fired an oven in, had never fed a stranger from in the middle of a 3-day blizzard. She thought about what he knew about this place and what he didn't know. And she thought about the difference between a man who sees the value of a thing and a man who has built the value himself. She thought about Ruth Kepler signing the document in Rochester, in the sitting room that smelled of bread, with the same careful practicality that her grandmother had pressed into a set of notes in a tin box on a shelf. She went back to the main room and picked up the ledger and opened it to the current page and made the entry for the day. The date, the supplies Denton Foyle had sent, the letter, the returning traveler, the state of the oven. Evidence, record. The accumulation of ordinary days that, stacked against each other, became the only argument that actually mattered. Outside, the late March light was doing the thing it did at this hour, going gold and flat across the snow in a way that didn't promise spring, but at least suggested the possibility of it, eventually, when it was ready. Clara wrote the date at the top of the page in her neat hand and kept going. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in the second week of April, in a borrowed courtroom in the Morton County Administrative Building in Mandan. A room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood, and the particular institutional staleness of a space that had hosted too many difficult conversations to retain any particular character of its own. Clara arrived the evening before with Hedda Marsh, having taken the stage from the trailhead in the early morning and spent the journey going over, one more time, the sequence of what they intended to present. Hedda had the documents organized in the careful, hierarchical way of a woman who had spent 18 years learning that the order in which you presented evidence was itself a form of argument. She explained this without condescension, which Clara appreciated, and Clara listened without pretending she already understood, which Hedda seemed to appreciate in return. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room, a practical meal, not a celebratory one, and went over the signed statements from the travelers one final time. 14 statements now, from people who had stopped at the station between January and March. 14 names and dates and descriptions of what they had found there. A working oven, a reliable well, a woman who dealt honestly, shelter in conditions that had, on at least 3 occasions, been genuinely dangerous. Hale's attorneys will argue that the statements are self-serving, Hedda said, setting down the last one. That you coached the witnesses. I didn't. I know. But they'll argue it anyway. Commissioner Price will know it's a weak argument, but they'll make it because it's what they have. She looked at Clara steadily. When they make it, don't react. Don't let your face do anything. My face doesn't do much. Hedda considered this. I've noticed. That's an asset. Clara looked at the stack of statements. What worries you most? A pause that was honest rather than reassuring. The gap in adverse possession. 2 months of continuous occupation is not the standard. Price may agree that your claim is morally persuasive and still find that the legal threshold hasn't been met. And Ruth Kepler's assignment? Changes the argument entirely if he accepts it. Ruth Kepler's inherited interest, assigned to you, gives you a legitimate chain of title that precedes Hale's filing by decades. He's not contesting a squatter's claim. He's contesting a title transfer, which is a substantially harder case. Hedda folded her hands on the table. But assignments can be challenged. Hale's attorneys will argue that Ruth's interest was dormant long enough to have been legally abandoned. It's not a strong argument under territorial law, but Price will have to consider it. What's his reputation for? Being slow and being thorough. Hedda picked up her coffee cup. I consider those the same quality described 2 different ways. Clara slept better than she expected to, which she attributed not to confidence but to exhaustion. The accumulated fatigue of 4 months of hard physical work and 2 weeks of sustained legal and logistical effort on top of it. She was tired in a way that went past the point where anxiety could get much purchase. She woke at 5, dressed in the best of the limited options she had, and went down to the hotel dining room and ate breakfast alone because Hedda was already in the courtroom arranging her documents. The dining room had 3 other occupied tables. At one of them, she recognized Aldrich, Victor Hale's man, the one who'd come to the station with his practiced smile in February. He was eating with 2 other men in good coats who had the compressed, purposeful energy of people preparing to do a job. Lawyers, she assumed. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and for a fraction of a second something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. She looked away and finished her breakfast. Victor Hale arrived at the courthouse at 8:30. Clara had not met him before. She'd understood this was likely, but hadn't thought carefully about what it would feel like, which turned out to be stranger than she'd anticipated. She had constructed, over 4 months, a very specific idea of who Victor Hale was, the idea built from Aldrich's smooth manner and Dowd's self-important document case, and the filed papers with their dense legal language, and the casual assumption embedded in all of it that a poor widow with a broken-down station had no realistic means of resistance. The man who came through the courthouse door was perhaps 60, heavy-set in the way of men who had once been physically substantial and had softened with prosperity. He wore a good coat and carried himself with the settled ease of a man for whom the world had generally arranged itself according to his preferences. And he looked around the room when he entered with the assessing expression of someone calculating the layout of a space he expected to control. He saw Clara. She was already seated at the respondent's table beside Hedda, with the cedar box on the table in front of her and the organized stack of documents under Hedda's hand. She met Hale's gaze directly and held it for exactly as long as was natural, and then looked away, because she wasn't trying to be theatrical about it. Hale sat down at the claimant's table. He didn't look at her again, which told her something. Commissioner Aldous Price arrived at 9 precisely. He was a thin man, older than Clara had imagined, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the deliberate movements of someone who had made a principle of not hurrying. He arranged his papers with exacting care, asked the room to come to order in a voice that was mild and somehow left no room for non-compliance, and opened the proceeding. Hale's attorneys went first, as the filing party. The lead attorney was a man named Custer, not a name that did him any favors, Clara thought, in this particular territory, who presented Hale's claim with the practiced fluency of a man who had made similar arguments many times. The land grant had lapsed. The property had been abandoned for over 15 years with no active ownership. Hale Freight and Land had filed properly under territorial statute. Mrs. Voss's occupation of the property, while perhaps sympathetic, did not meet the legal threshold for adverse possession and had no basis in title chain. It was a clean argument, Clara would give it that. It was the kind of argument that worked best when there was no one on the other side who had done their research. Hedda let Custer finish completely before she stood up. She began with Ruth Kepler. She presented the 1861 land grant to Thomas Crow, the original document, obtained from the Territorial Records Office, showing the legal boundaries of the Crow Station parcel and the name of the original grantee. She presented the probate research showing that Thomas Crowe's estate had never been properly resolved after his death in 1871. She presented Ruth Alderman Kepler's sworn statement, signed in Rochester, witnessed by a Minnesota attorney, and notarized, affirming her status as the heir of Thomas Crowe's surviving daughter and her voluntary assignment of that inherited interest to Clara Voss in exchange for agreed consideration. She presented the assignment document itself, signed, witnessed, notarized. She placed it in front of Commissioner Price with the particular quiet of a person who understands that some things speak better without accompaniment. Price looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, slowly, without apparent hurry, giving it the full attention it deserved and not a fraction more. He set it down and looked at the land grant and looked at the assignment again. Custer was on his feet. "Commissioner, the assignment of a dormant interest." "I can see what it is, Mr. Custer." Price's voice was mild. "Sit down." Custer sat. Price looked at Hedda. "The gap between the original grant and the assignment, the period of dormancy. You're arguing that the interest survived throughout?" "I am. Under territorial statute, an unresolved estate interest does not lapse without a formal declaration of abandonment by the interest holder. No such declaration was ever made. The interest existed in probate limbo from 1871 until Mrs. Kepler's affirmation last month." Hedda paused. "It was dormant. It was not extinguished." "Mr. Custer, your response." Custer's response was the argument Hedda had predicted. The dormancy argument, the abandonment argument, the length of time elapsed. It was delivered with skill, but Clara could hear, underneath the skill, the hollow space where the strongest version of his argument should have been. He was working with what he had, and what he had was not enough. Price listened without expression. When Custer finished, Price made a note and then said, "I'd like to hear from the respondent about the property's condition and her activities there." Clara stood up. She had prepared for this, and also knew that preparation only went so far, that at some point you were standing in front of someone who was going to make a judgment about whether you were telling the truth, and the only thing that worked for that was actually telling it. She told the truth. She described the property as she had found it in January. The collapsed roof section, the open window frames, the frozen floor, the bakehouse with its seized iron door and cracked arch. She described the repairs she had made one by one in the order she had made them, with the approximate dates and the materials. She described firing the oven for the first time in the first batch of bread that had failed, and the second that hadn't. She described the travelers, their names, where they were going, what they had left in exchange for bread and water and shelter. She described the blizzard in March, and the 12 people who had been inside the station for 3 days and had left alive. She did not try to make it moving. She did not try to make it dramatic. She stated it the way she had written it in the ledger, factually, specifically, in the order it had happened. When she sat down, the room was quiet in a particular way. Price made several notes. He looked at the cedar box on the table. "Mrs. Voss, the records you've described, the ledger, the trade entries, the repair documentation, you have those with you?" "Yes." She opened the cedar box and produced them, organized in the same sequence she'd described. He examined them for a long time. He examined the signed traveler statements. He examined the copy of Eliza Crow's notes that Clara had included, not as a legal document, but as contextual evidence of the property's history, Hedda's idea, and a good one. He looked at the last page of Eliza's notes, at the cramped handwriting and the sentence, "I am going anyway." He set it down. "I'm going to take a recess," Price said. The recess lasted 2 hours, which was long enough for Clara to drink 3 cups of bad coffee in the building's small anteroom, and for Hedda to review her documents one more time, and for Noah, who had arrived on the morning stage with Denton Foyle's brother-in-law, who had offered to drive him, and had apparently spent the journey telling Noah about freight logistics, in a way that Noah had found genuinely interesting, to find his mother in the anteroom and sit beside her without saying much. "How did it go?" he asked. "I don't know yet." Did Hale look worried? Clara thought about this. He looked like a man who isn't used to situations he can't control. Noah considered that. Is that the same as worried? Close enough. Hale's attorneys spent most of the recess in a separate corner of the building, in conversation that involved low voices and the occasional sharp gesture. Hale himself sat apart from them with the rigid stillness of a man exercising considerable discipline over his expression. Once, across the length of the building, his eyes met Clara's. She looked at him steadily. He looked away first. She didn't feel triumphant about that. She felt tired and cautious, and aware that the recess ending didn't mean anything was settled yet. When Price came back to the room and arranged his papers with his characteristic unhurried precision and looked up, Clara realized she was holding her breath and let it out slowly. "I've considered the filings and the evidence presented in this proceeding," Price said, "and I want to address each element directly." He addressed the adverse possession claim first. Clara had not met the standard time threshold, he confirmed, which was the ruling she'd expected and which Hedda had prepared her for. 2 months of continuous occupation was not sufficient under territorial statute. On that basis alone, the claim could not stand. Hale shifted at his table. Then Price turned to the assignment. "The assignment of Ruth Alderman Kepler's inherited interest is a different matter," he said. "The original grant to Thomas Crow in 1861 was a valid conveyance. Mr. Crow's death in 1871 did not extinguish the grant. It placed it in probate, unresolved. The claimant's assertion that dormancy equals abandonment is not supported by territorial statute, and I find no legal basis for the argument that the passage of time alone, without a formal declaration of abandonment, extinguishes an heir's interest in real property." Custer was very still. "The assignment executed by Ruth Alderman Kepler is a valid legal instrument transferring her inherited interest to Clara Voss," Price continued. "That interest predates and supersedes Mr. Hale's filing. The property described in the 1861 grant to Thomas Crow, the parcel presently occupied and improved by Mrs. Voss, is therefore conveyed to Mrs. Voss by right of assignment, effective from the date of execution." He looked up from his papers. "The claim of Hale freight and land is denied." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that hasn't settled yet. The moment between a stone hitting water and the ripples beginning. Clara heard Hale's chair scrape back. She heard Custer's voice, controlled but tightly so, beginning an objection that Price acknowledged and noted and dismissed in the same calm, unhurried breath. She heard Hedda beside her exhale something that was almost a word but not quite. She sat very still. Noah, beside her, put his hand on the table between them, which was not quite reaching for her hand but was in the vicinity of it, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment, while the room sorted itself into the aftermath of what had just happened. Hale left the courthouse without speaking to her. She had not expected him to, but she had been aware, in some corner of her attention, of the possibility. The confrontation some part of her had been braced for since January. The moment where the man who had sent Aldrich and Dowd and his attorneys and his filed papers would finally face her directly and say something. Threaten, explain, justify. Something. He walked out with his coat on and his attorneys beside him, and his face held in an expression that revealed nothing, and the door closed behind him, and that was the end of Victor Hale in this particular story. There would be no dramatic confrontation. There would be no scene. Sometimes the thing you've been braced for simply doesn't happen, and the absence of it is its own kind of answer. Hale had made a calculation, lost the calculation, and moved on to the next calculation. That was who he was, and it meant that Clara was not worth his continued attention, which was exactly the kind of victory she wanted. Hedda was talking to Commissioner Price about the paperwork that needed to be processed and the timeline for the formal deed transfer, and Clara stood in the emptying room with Noah and let herself understand, slowly, what had just occurred. She owned the station. Not in the way she'd owned the house she'd been thrown out of in December. That had been Martin's name on the documents, Martin's legal standing, with Clara's presence in it by marriage and assumption rather than by right. This was different. The deed, when it was processed, would have her name on it, Clara Voss, as the owner of the Crow Station parcel by valid legal transfer. It was a smaller thing than it should have been, probably, in the broader sense of what women were permitted to own and control in 1888 in the Dakota Territory. She was aware of that. But it was also the specific thing she had needed, and it had been won by work and documentation and a chain of human decisions stretching back to a woman in 1861 who had built an oven right and left her notes for whoever came after. She found, standing there, that she wanted to say something to Eliza Crow. Not thank her exactly. That felt too small. And besides, the feeling was too complicated for thank you to contain it. More like, I understand now what you were doing. I understand what you were trying to leave behind. She didn't say it out loud. She said it in the private space where things get said when there's no one to say them to. Noah was watching her. Are you all right? Yes. You don't look all right. She looked at him, at his too long hair and his serious face, and the ink stain on his left forefinger from the letter he'd been writing the night before to Denton Foyle's brother-in-law about the freight arrangement. He was 10 years old, and he had managed a working station alone for 8 days and had not complained once about it, and he was watching her now with the focused attention of someone who needed the honest answer rather than the reassuring one. I'm tired, she said. I'm very tired, and She stopped. I don't have the right word for the other thing. Relieved? More than that. He thought about it. Like when you put down something heavy that you've been carrying a long time? She looked at her son. Yes, she said. Exactly like that. They were back at the station by Thursday evening, arriving in the particular gold light that April was beginning to produce, warmer than March, thinner than it would be by May, but light that at least suggested the possibility of warmth, rather than simply existing in defiance of the cold. The oven was cold. Noah had banked it before he left, and it had burned down over the 2 days they'd been gone, the thermal mass bleeding its stored heat gradually into the bakehouse until the temperature equalized with the outside air. Clara set the cedar box on the shelf and went to the bakehouse. She built the first fire small, the way she always did now, the way Eliza's notes had described, birch bark and fine shavings, just enough to begin the conversation with the clay. She fed it slowly over the next hour, watching the smoke change as the firebox warmed, feeling the subtle shift in the air of the bakehouse as the thermal mass began to respond. This was the thing she hadn't understood in January and understood now. The oven didn't start working when the fire started burning. It started working after time, after the heat had moved through the layers of clay and stone and done what heat does slowly, which is change the nature of things from the inside out. The fire was just the beginning of the process. The process was what mattered. She thought about patience, which was a word she'd been living with for 4 months, and which had turned out to mean something more specific than she'd previously understood. It didn't mean waiting, it didn't mean accepting delay. It meant doing the work that only time could complete, and doing it correctly, and trusting the process rather than the timetable. She was not a patient woman by nature. She was aware of that, the same way she suspected Eliza Crow had been aware of it, about herself. The oven had not cared. The oven had only responded to what she did, not what she was by inclination, and so she had learned to do the patient thing even when she felt the impatient version of it pulling at her from the inside. Noah came to the bakehouse doorway. Denton Foyle's man dropped another delivery while we were gone, left it in the main room. He paused. There was a letter with it, from Ruth Kepler. Clara looked up from the fire. What did she say? I didn't read it. It's addressed to you. She fed the fire one more piece of wood and went to the main room and opened the letter. Ruth's handwriting was neat and economical, like her speech. No words spent on anything that wasn't doing work. Mrs. Voss, it began. My attorney has confirmed the deed transfer is proceeding without complication. I want to tell you something I did not say when you were here, which is that I almost didn't reply to your attorney's first letter. I had lived long enough without thinking about that property that the idea of it coming back into my life felt like more trouble than I was interested in. What changed my mind was something your attorney wrote in her summary of your situation. She wrote that you had found my grandmother's notes and used them, that you had repaired the oven using the techniques she described. I don't know why that mattered to me as much as it did. It just seemed like the right continuation of something. My mother used to say that her mother left Dakota Territory with nothing. I think now that wasn't entirely true. She left with what she knew, and apparently she left it in a tin box on a shelf in case someone needed it. Please do send the copy of the notes when you're ready. I would like to know what she knew. Clara folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she went back to the bakehouse and tended the fire. She made the fair copy of Eliza's notes over the following week, in the evenings after the bread was done and the oven was banked and the day's accounts were recorded. She copied each page in her own hand, smaller and neater than Eliza's, including the crossed-out passages and the margin corrections and the obliterated word, which she noted as word illegible, because she wanted to be accurate, and the last page with its admission of defeat and its decision to go anyway. She added a letter of her own at the end because she had promised Ruth one, and also because by the time she reached the last page of the copy, she found she had things to say. She wrote about the first fire, how she'd built it too small and too cautious, and it had smoked badly, and she'd had to pull it out and start over, feeling like an idiot. She wrote about the clay repair on the arch and how she hadn't known if it would hold, and hadn't found out until the oven was at temperature, and the clay sounded like stone when she tapped it. She wrote about the first loaf that had failed and the second that hadn't, and the particular quality of the relief she'd felt when she cut into a loaf that had actually risen, which she said she still didn't have the right word for. She wrote, "I think what your grandmother was trying to teach herself, and what she passed on without knowing she was passing it on, was not really about ovens. It was about paying attention to the nature of something before you try to make it do what you want. The oven doesn't respond to effort alone. It responds to understanding. That is, I've come to think, true of most things worth building." She paused and looked at what she'd written. Then she added, "I am not a patient woman. I don't think Eliza Crow was either." I think she learned, as I have been learning, that patience isn't a quality you have. It's a practice you do. Every day you choose it over the alternative. Some days it's harder than others. She sealed the letter and the copy together in an envelope and gave it to the next eastbound traveler who stopped, with the address in Rochester on the front and enough coin to cover the postage. April became May, and May was when the territory stopped being merely survivable and became, in small increments, something closer to alive. The trail traffic increased with the warming weather, and the station's reputation, which had been building since January through the particular telegraph of frontier word of mouth, had reached a point where some travelers came specifically for it rather than just stopping because they happened to pass by. Denton Foyle's arrangement was working. The regular flour deliveries meant Clara could bake at scale rather than rationing, and the referral arrangement meant Foyle's name was being spoken by travelers across 100 miles of trail in both directions, which was exactly what he'd wanted. She hired help in May, a woman named Ines, the wife of a farmer whose claim was 2 miles south, who came 3 mornings a week and had strong hands and a quick, undemonstrative competence that reminded Clara of herself in a way she found both flattering and slightly unsettling. Ines didn't ask many questions and didn't require much direction, and had a way of identifying what needed doing and doing it that made the morning bread production run considerably more smoothly than it had when Clara was managing everything alone. Noah, meanwhile, had developed an interest in the records and the accounts that went beyond his initial role of keeping the ledger while Clara was away. He'd reorganized the system in May, without asking permission, which Clara would have been annoyed about if the reorganization hadn't been genuinely better, adding a column for weather conditions and a separate register for repeat travelers, on the theory that knowing who came through regularly was useful information for planning supply orders. He was not wrong. Clara told him so. He accepted this with the equanimity of a person who had already known he was right and didn't require the confirmation, which was a quality she found both admirable and mildly irritating, the same way she found most things admirable and mildly irritating when they reminded her of herself. The formal deed arrived in late May, carried by a courier from the county office. It was a single page, legally dense, with Clara's name printed in the appropriate blank and Commissioner Price's signature at the bottom. It was not beautiful. It was not dramatic. It was a piece of paper with legal language on it that said, in the elaborate circumlocution of official documents, that this place was hers. She put it in the cedar box. She did not hold a ceremony or make a speech or do anything that could be described as marking the occasion, because that was not who she was, and it had not been that kind of journey. Not the kind with clean moments of arrival, but the kind that moved forward in accumulated ordinary days until you looked back and realized how far you'd come from where you started. She went to the bakehouse and fired the oven. One evening in June, she came out of the bakehouse and found Noah standing in front of the oven with his arms folded and his head slightly tilted, in the posture he'd developed for problems he was working through below the surface. "What?" she said. "Nothing. I was thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "She built this oven and then she left. And then nobody used it for 20 years, and then you came and fixed it and used it. And now—" He gestured at the bakehouse, the main room, the station in general. "It's this." "Yes." "Do Do you think she'd be upset that someone else is using it? Clara considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. She thought about Eliza Crow's notes, the frustration visible in the pressed handwriting, the second thoughts in the margins, the last page with its admission and its decision. She thought about a tin box on a shelf in a bakehouse that had been abandoned for 20 years, still there, still holding what had been put in it. "No," she said. "I think she'd be glad the oven is still burning." Noah thought about this. "Can I fire it tomorrow, the morning batch?" She looked at him. He was asking in the way he'd learned to ask for things he'd already thought through carefully. Not impulsively, not as a test, but as a genuine request from a person who had considered whether he was ready for something. "You've watched enough times," she said. "I know the process. You know the theory. It's different." "I know." He met her eyes. "But you had to do it the first time, too." She had nothing to argue with in that. She thought about January, the seized iron door and the cracked arch and the birch bark fire she'd built the size of her two fists, and fed almost nothing for an hour, feeling ridiculous, feeling uncertain, feeling the gap between what she knew from reading about something and what she knew from doing it. "Don't rush the first fire," she said. "I know." "I mean it, Noah. It doesn't matter how slow it seems. Mama." He looked at her with this patient steadiness of a 10-year-old who had been listening carefully for 4 months. "I know." She let out a breath. "Okay." In the morning, she stood in the bakehouse doorway while he built the first fire, and she kept her hands at her sides and her face still, and she did not intervene, even when he fed the fire a fraction more than she would have at that stage, and she felt the instinct to say something rise up in her and chose to let it go. He was reading the oven the way she'd learned to read it, watching the smoke, feeling the heat coming back out of the chamber, adjusting by observation rather than by formula. He made one error and corrected it himself before she'd fully registered that it was an error. He fed the fire in the patient increments that the oven required, and after an hour the clay face of the oven was beginning to radiate in that deep, considered way that meant the thermal mass was responding. He didn't look at her for approval. He watched the oven. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her son and thought about what she would tell someone, if they asked, about what this year had taught her. She thought she'd say something like this, that the frontier didn't care about your intentions. It didn't reward effort by itself, or suffering by itself, or even intelligence by itself. What it rewarded, what it responded to, was the combination of understanding and persistence. Knowing the nature of a thing and continuing to work with that nature even when it was slow and uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. She'd learned that from an oven. She'd learned it from a woman she'd never met, through notes left in a tin box on a shelf. She'd learned it from the accumulated days of January and February and March, each one asking her to do the same thing over again and doing it anyway. She was not a patient woman. She had not become one. What she had become was a woman who did the patient thing regardless, which was not the same as having the quality, but was, in practical terms, equivalent to it. That was the lesson the oven had taught Eliza Crow. That was the lesson Eliza had pressed into her notes, whether she'd known she was writing it or not. Not that patience was a virtue to be cultivated in the abstract, but that patience was a practice to be done in the specific, this fire, this clay, this particular morning, this next thing, and then the next. The bakehouse smelled of warming clay and the first faint trace of heat coming off the oven's face. Brass was asleep in the doorway behind Clara's feet, his copper coat catching the early light in that way he had, as if even the quality of his sleep was slightly more than ordinary. Noah reached forward and adjusted the iron door by a fraction, changing the draw, and the fire inside responded the way fires respond to the right attention. It settled into itself and burned cleaner. Clara watched. She thought about the deed in the cedar box, and the ledger with its careful entries, and the stack of signed statements from 14 travelers who had been warm and fed in a building that had been abandoned for 20 years. She thought about Ruth Kepler in Rochester, who had perhaps by now received the copy of her grandmother's notes. She thought about Eliza Crow leaving, going anyway, as she had written, though she hadn't learned the lesson, and what it meant that the thing she'd built had outlasted her departure. Some things survive because they're sturdy. Some things survive because they're maintained. And some things survive because someone comes along who understands what they are and what they were made for and decides, for reasons that might not be entirely rational, that they're worth keeping. Clara had made that decision in January in a broken building in a Dakota winter with nothing to her name and a 10-year-old son and a borrowed mule and a box of papers. She had not made the decision because she was certain it would work. She had made it because not making it was not something she could live with. That was the only truth she was certain of. Not that the strong survive, or the clever, or the lucky, though those things mattered and she wouldn't pretend otherwise, but that the ones who refused to define themselves by what they'd lost had a different relationship to what came next. Not a guaranteed one, not a smooth one, just a different one. Noah turned from the oven and looked at her. "It's warming," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The oven held the heat the way it had always held it, from the inside out, slowly, in the deep, patient way of something built to last. The fire was small, but it was right, and the clay was doing what clay does when it's properly worked and properly tended. Outside, the June morning was opening up over the Dakota plain in that enormous, indifferent way it had, the sky going from gray to pale gold to the particular wide blue that made you understand, viscerally, what people meant when they talked about the size of the West. The trail was visible from the bakehouse window, and there would be travelers on it before the morning was out, coming from both directions. Some of them knowing the station was here, and some of them discovering it for the first time. All of them would find the same thing, a woman who dealt honestly, a well that worked, and bread from an oven that had been burning since January. It would keep burning. That was the decision Clara had made, and it was not a decision you made once. It was a decision you made every morning when you built the first fire, and every evening when you banked it, and every day in between when the work was hard and the margin was thin and the outcome was still, always, not entirely certain. She made it again now, in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, with the warmth of the oven at her back and her son's careful hands tending the fire.